Welcome, seekers of hidden truths, to the shadowed depths where mysteries sleep beneath the surface of known reality. Tonight, we descend into the labyrinthine theories that spiral through Jujutsu Kaisen's universe like incense smoke rising from ancient shrines. Here, in the space between waking knowledge and dreaming speculation, we explore the whispered possibilities that dance just beyond canonical certainty. These are the theories that haunt the margins of understanding, the questions that linger when official answers fade into silence. So let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of contemplative wonder. Allow your consciousness to drift between certainty and mystery, and surrender to the infinite questions that make this world so beautifully, eternally enigmatic. The moon hangs heavy in the night sky above Tokyo Jujutsu High, its silver face bearing witness to transformations that echo through both mortal flesh and immortal spirit. In the intricate tapestry that Gege Akutami has woven throughout Jujutsu Kaisen, no symbol carries more profound weight than this ancient celestial guardian, whose full brilliance has illuminated every moment of rebirth, every threshold crossed between one existence and another. The lunar theory that permeates the series is not mere coincidence, but deliberate invocation of Buddhist philosophy, where the full moon represents the completion of one cycle and the birth of another. When Yuji Itadori first consumed Sukuna's finger beneath that luminous orb, the symbolism was as intentional as it was beautiful. The moon that watched over this moment of convergence between vessel and curse was the same that had overseen countless such transformations throughout Buddhist tradition, where lunar cycles mark the rhythm of death and rebirth, of consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of individual existence. The finger itself was not merely a cursed object, but a seed of potential, planted in fertile spiritual ground beneath the blessing of celestial forces that had governed such transitions since humans first looked upward and wondered about the nature of existence itself. The second significant appearance of the full moon came during the Star Plasma Vessel mission, when Riko Amanai was scheduled to merge with Master Tengen in a ritual that would preserve the barriers protecting Japanese civilization from supernatural annihilation. Here again, the lunar symbolism spoke to themes of sacrifice and transformation, the willing dissolution of individual identity in service of collective survival. The moon that illuminated Riko's final night as an independent consciousness was the same that had watched over countless bodhisattvas who chose compassion over personal liberation, who embraced the painful joy of serving something greater than their own desires for peace or happiness. But the moon's influence extends far deeper than these obvious moments of transformation, threading through the series like silver wire, connecting seemingly disparate elements into patterns that reveal the underlying spiritual architecture of Akutami's vision. Every domain expansion occurs within spaces that exist outside normal temporal flow, pocket universes where the practitioner's inner reality becomes external law, and the moon serves as reminder that consciousness itself is capable of such reality-altering expansion when properly understood and directed. The Buddhist concept of the full moon as perfect enlightenment finds its expression not just in moments of character development, but in the fundamental structure of cursed energy itself, that force which emerges from negative human emotions, but can be refined through discipline and understanding into techniques that protect rather than destroy. Like moonlight transforming darkness without eliminating it, cursed energy techniques allow sorcerers to work with the fundamental negativity of human existence rather than futilely attempting to transcend or eliminate it. The historical figure who would become the legendary Ryomen Sukuna lived during Japan's classical period, a time when the boundaries between history and mythology were far more porous than modern sensibilities typically acknowledge. The records that survive describe a being of contradictory nature, possessed of superhuman strength and intelligence, but also capable of both extraordinary cruelty and unexpected compassion. These accounts, filtered through centuries of oral tradition and political manipulation, eventually crystallized into the folklore figure that Akutami would later resurrect as the King of Curses. The original Sukuna was described as possessing 4 arms and 2 faces, physical characteristics that marked him as fundamentally different from ordinary humans, while suggesting connections to Hindu and Buddhist iconography, where multiple limbs and faces represent expanded consciousness or divine authority. But rather than depicting him as purely divine or demonic, the historical accounts present someone whose extraordinary nature manifested in profoundly human ways through acts of protection and destruction that reflected the full spectrum of human moral possibility, amplified beyond normal scale. The worship that surrounded the historical Sukuna was not the fearful propitiation typically offered to malevolent spirits, but something more complex: recognition of power that could manifest as either salvation or destruction depending on circumstances and the character of those who encountered it. Villages that honored him properly received protection from bandits and natural disasters, while those that showed disrespect or attempted to exploit his power faced consequences that became legendary for their thoroughness and creativity. This duality in the historical accounts provides crucial insight into Akutami's characterization of the fictional Sukuna, whose personality encompasses both the refined aesthete who appreciates beauty and technique and the ruthless destroyer who views human life as expendable entertainment. The contradiction is not narrative inconsistency, but faithful representation of the complex figure preserved in Japanese folklore, someone whose moral framework operated according to principles that transcended ordinary human categories of good and evil. The rituals that were performed in Sukuna's honor during the Heian era involved offerings of crafted objects and displays of skill rather than simple tribute or sacrifice, suggesting that what he valued most was evidence of human potential realized through dedication and artistry. This preference for quality over quantity, for mastery over mere power, echoes through the fictional Sukuna's reactions to contemporary sorcerers, his disdain for those who rely on raw strength without refinement, and his grudging respect for those who demonstrate true understanding of their abilities. The ancient Indian cosmology that influenced the naming of Jogo's domain expansion, Coffin of the Iron Mountain, represents just one example of how deeply Akutami has researched the philosophical and mythological traditions that inform his fictional world. The concept of 9 mountains and 8 seas, encompassing reality, with a central mountain of iron forming the axis around which all existence revolves, provides a cosmic framework that transforms what might have been a simple combat technique into something approaching religious experience. In the original cosmological system, the Iron Mountain served as both boundary and foundation, the immovable principle that prevented the dissolution of ordered reality into primordial chaos. Jogo's domain expansion invokes this same concept, creating a space where his will becomes natural law, and opponents find themselves constrained by forces that operate beyond the normal categories of physical or supernatural influence. The coffin aspect adds the dimension of death and transformation, suggesting that entering this domain means accepting the possibility of fundamental change in one's relationship to existence itself. The fact that Akutami chose to base Jogo's technique on such obscure but profound mythological concepts demonstrates the depth of research and intention that goes into even seemingly straightforward combat scenarios. Every domain expansion is not just a tactical technique, but a philosophical statement about the nature of reality and consciousness, a manifestation of the practitioner's deepest understanding of how individual will can shape collective experience. The visual similarities between Master Tengen's evolved form and the mythological descriptions of Sukuna suggest connections that go far deeper than mere aesthetic coincidence. Both beings have transcended normal human limitations through processes that involved fundamental alteration of their relationship to mortality and individual identity, becoming something that exists at the intersection of human consciousness and cosmic principle. The four eyes that both display are positioned in patterns that mirror classical depictions of enlightened beings in Buddhist art, where multiple organs of perception represent expanded awareness that encompasses both mundane and transcendent reality simultaneously. But perhaps most significantly, both Tengen and Sukuna chose to maintain some connection to humanity despite having evolved beyond the need for such limitations, suggesting that true transcendence involves not the abandonment of human values, but their perfection and preservation through forms that can survive the dissolution of individual mortal existence. The barriers that Tengen maintains protect not just physical territory, but the possibility for human civilization to continue developing according to its own internal logic rather than being overwhelmed by forces that operate according to completely alien principles. The moon that watches over all these transformations and revelations serves as constant reminder that change itself is the fundamental constant, that the cycles of death and rebirth that govern individual existence are reflected in the larger patterns that shape historical epochs and cosmic ages. The theories that surround these lunar appearances are not mere speculation, but attempts to understand how spiritual principles manifest in narrative structure, how ancient wisdom finds expression through contemporary storytelling that speaks to eternal human concerns about meaning, purpose, and the price of power. The architecture of power in the Jujutsu Kaisen universe reveals itself not through sudden inspiration, but through careful observation of the natural world and the systematic analysis of forces that govern both physical reality and human consciousness. When Gege Akutami crafted the fundamental mechanics of cursed energy, he was not creating entirely new concepts, but rather drawing connections between ancient philosophical traditions and contemporary understanding of how energy manifests through intention, emotion, and disciplined practice. The similarities between cursed energy and the Nen system from Hunter x Hunter are neither coincidental nor derivative, but represent parallel explorations of how supernatural abilities might emerge from the systematic cultivation of life, force that exists within all living beings. Both systems require rigorous training that goes far beyond simple physical conditioning, demanding psychological development that allows practitioners to access and direct energies that remain dormant in ordinary individuals who have never learned to perceive or manipulate the subtle forces that flow through every moment of, quote, conscious existence. In both systems, the initial barrier to accessing these abilities is not lack of potential, but lack of awareness. The fundamental inability of untrained individuals to recognize that they possess capacities that transcend the limitations they have been taught to accept as permanent and unchangeable. The training processes that unlock these abilities involve not the acquisition of something new, but the removal of mental and emotional obstacles that prevent conscious access to powers that have always existed within the practitioner's essential nature. The visual similarities between cursed energy and Nen extend beyond mere aesthetic choice into philosophical territory, where the representation of internal states through external manifestation becomes a fundamental principle governing how consciousness interacts with physical reality. Both systems acknowledge that the boundary between internal experience and external environment is far more fluid than ordinary perception suggests, that sufficient understanding and discipline can allow individual will to reshape the fundamental properties of space, time, and matter through focused intention backed by emotional commitment. But perhaps most significantly, both systems recognize that true mastery requires not just technical proficiency, but moral development that ensures such extraordinary abilities serve constructive rather than destructive purposes. The psychological requirements for advanced techniques in both series reflect understanding that power without wisdom inevitably leads to corruption, that the capacity to reshape reality according to personal will demands corresponding development of wisdom that can distinguish between desires that serve genuine need and those that merely reflect ego gratification or fear-based control. The scientific foundation underlying the black flash phenomenon represents one of the most elegant examples of how Akutami integrates genuine scientific principles with supernatural mechanics to create abilities that feel both fantastical and plausible. The mantis shrimp, that remarkable crustacean whose hunting technique inspired this devastating attack, demonstrates how natural selection can produce mechanisms that achieve effects seemingly impossible according to ordinary understanding of biological limitations. When the mantis shrimp strikes its prey, the velocity of its club-like appendage creates cavitation bubbles in the surrounding water, temporary voids that collapse with such violence that they generate temperatures approaching those found on the surface of the sun and produce flashes of light visible to the naked eye. The force generated by this collapse exceeds anything the creature could achieve through simple mechanical impact, transforming the physics of fluid dynamics into a weapon of extraordinary effectiveness that operates through principles most humans never encounter in their daily experience. The translation of this biological phenomenon into the mechanics of black flash required understanding not just the physical processes involved, but the mental and emotional states that might allow human practitioners to achieve similar effects through supernatural means. The precise timing required for black flash, that window of 1/1,000,000th of a second between physical impact and cursed energy application, mirrors the extraordinary coordination that allows the mantis shrimp to achieve its remarkable feats, while suggesting that such precision might be achievable through training that develops superhuman awareness and control. But the deeper significance of black flash lies not in its devastating power, but in what it represents about the relationship between physical technique and spiritual development, the way that perfect synchronization of intention, emotion, and action can produce effects that transcend the sum of their individual components. The spatial distortion that occurs during black flash suggests that reality itself becomes more malleable when human consciousness achieves states of perfect integration, that the boundaries between internal experience and external manifestation dissolve when practitioners reach levels of focus and commitment that most people never attempt to develop. The domain expansion technique represents perhaps the most sophisticated expression of how individual consciousness can reshape collective reality through sufficient understanding and power, creating pocket universes where the practitioner's internal logic becomes external law, governing everything within the designated space. These techniques require not just enormous reserves of cursed energy, but psychological development that allows the creation of coherent alternate realities that can maintain their integrity despite existing within and alongside ordinary space-time. The process of domain expansion involves the temporary suspension of normal physical laws within the affected area, replacing them with principles that reflect the practitioner's deepest understanding of how reality should function, according to their personal philosophy and emotional truth. This is not mere illusion or psychological manipulation, but actual alteration of the fundamental forces that govern matter, energy, space, and time within the domain's boundaries, creating environments where impossible things become inevitable and ordinary limitations lose their constraining power. Each domain expansion reveals not just the technical capabilities of its creator, but their essential character, the core beliefs and values that shape their approach to existence and their relationship with others. Gojo's unlimited void overwhelms opponents with infinite information, reflecting his understanding that knowledge without the capacity to process it becomes a form of paralysis. That perfect perception divorced from emotional wisdom can become its own form of blindness rather than enlightenment. Sukuna's malevolent shrine operates through principles of absolute destruction that acknowledge no distinction between guilty and innocent, friend and enemy, valuable and worthless, reflecting a worldview that has moved beyond ordinary moral categories into something approaching cosmic indifference, where individual human concerns become irrelevant compared to the aesthetic pleasure of perfect technique applied without restraint or compromise. The incomplete nature of many domain expansions, particularly those created by younger sorcerers who have not yet achieved full integration of their technical abilities with their psychological development, suggests that these techniques require not just power but wisdom, not just skill, but character development that can sustain the enormous responsibility that comes with the ability to reshape reality according to personal will and vision. Hikari's domain expansion, which transforms combat into a pachinko gambling experience where jackpots provide temporary invincibility, represents one of the most theoretically interesting applications of how game mechanics might be integrated into supernatural combat systems. The statistical improbability of his consistent success suggests either supernatural luck that operates beyond normal mathematical probability or deliberate manipulation of the random factors that should govern his techniques. Effectiveness. The theory that Hikari's domain is somehow rigged in his favor raises profound questions about the nature of luck itself and whether practitioners might be capable of influencing probability through means that transcend ordinary understanding of cause and effect relationships. If domains are truly expressions of their creator's deepest understanding of reality, then Hikari's consistent gambling success might reflect not cheating, but a fundamental belief that fortune favors those bold enough to risk everything on uncertain outcomes. But the alternative interpretation, that Hikari has somehow developed conscious control over random factors that should remain beyond human influence, suggests possibilities even more remarkable than simple good luck. The ability to manipulate probability would represent mastery over one of the most fundamental aspects of how reality functions, the capacity to influence outcomes that exist at the intersection of human choice and cosmic chance in ways that blur the distinction between supernatural technique and divine intervention. The mathematical precision required for such manipulation would exceed anything achieved by conventional cursed energy techniques, demanding understanding of statistical mechanics and quantum probability that most practitioners could never hope to develop alongside their combat training. Yet the consistent nature of Hikari's success suggests that such understanding might emerge naturally from sufficient commitment to gambling as both practical technique and philosophical worldview that embraces uncertainty as the placid, fundamental condition of existence. The pachinko machine itself, with its seemingly random distribution of ball trajectories influenced by countless tiny variations in initial conditions, becomes a metaphor for how small differences in intention, preparation, and timing can produce dramatically different outcomes in ways that appear random to outside observers, but might be subject to influence by practitioners who have developed sufficient sensitivity to the subtle factors that determine where Chaos resolves into pattern. The evolution of power systems in supernatural fiction reflects broader cultural shifts in how we understand the relationship between individual capability and collective responsibility, the ways that extraordinary abilities might be developed and deployed in service of values that transcend personal ambition or tribal loyalty. Early examples of supernatural powers in fiction often emphasized innate gifts or divine blessing, abilities that marked their possessors as fundamentally different from ordinary humans, in ways that created natural hierarchies based on inherited rather than developed capabilities. But contemporary power systems like those found in Jujutsu Kaisen and Hunter x Hunter reflect understanding that true strength emerges through disciplined practice that integrates physical training with psychological development and moral education, that the most effective practitioners are those who have learned to balance individual capability with awareness of their obligations to others and their responsibility for the consequences of how they choose to use their extraordinary abilities. This shift represents not just changes in storytelling preferences, but deeper cultural recognition that power without wisdom creates more problems than it solves, that the capacity to reshape reality according to personal will demand corresponding development of character that can ensure such abilities serve constructive rather than destructive purposes. The training arcs that have become central to supernatural fiction serve not just as vehicles for demonstrating character growth, but as exploration of how human potential might be developed through methods that honor both individual achievement and collective welfare. The scientific grounding that Akutami provides for his supernatural techniques reflects contemporary understanding that the most effective fantasy operates not through complete abandonment of natural law, but through extrapolation from genuine, scientific principles that are pushed beyond their normal applications in ways that remain internally consistent even when they transcend ordinary possibility. The mantis shrimp's cavitation bubble technique, the gravitational effects that might be produced through spatial manipulation, the information processing requirements for unlimited perception. These foundations in actual scientific phenomena make the supernatural techniques feel plausible, even when they operate at scales that exceed anything achievable through purely natural means. But perhaps most importantly, the power systems in Jujutsu Kaisen acknowledge that technique alone is insufficient for true mastery, that the most effective practitioners are those who have developed not just the ability to manipulate cursed energy, but the wisdom to understand when such manipulation serves genuine necessity rather than personal preference or emotional reaction. The strongest sorcerers are not necessarily those with the most devastating techniques, but those who have achieved sufficient psychological integration to use their abilities in ways that serve something greater than their own immediate desires or fears. This recognition that power and wisdom must develop together, that technical mastery without moral development leads inevitably to corruption and destruction, represents one of the most sophisticated aspects of how contemporary supernatural fiction approaches questions about human potential and the responsibilities that come with extraordinary capability. The cursed energy that emerges from negative human emotions can be refined through discipline and understanding into techniques that protect rather than destroy, but only by practitioners who have learned to transform their own relationship with suffering, fear, and anger into something that serves healing rather than perpetuating the cycles of harm that created their power in the first place. The weight of unspoken words hangs heavier than any curse between two souls who have shared the deepest bonds of friendship and understanding, only to watch those connections strain and eventually shatter under the pressure of irreconcilable philosophical differences. In the final moments of Suguru Geto's life, as he lay broken and defeated in that narrow alley behind the elementary school, where children's laughter had been replaced by the echoes of supernatural violence. Satoru Gojo knelt beside the man who had once been his closest companion and spoke words that would never reach the ears of those who witnessed this tragic conclusion to their complex relationship. The mystery of what Gojo said to the dying Geto has haunted fans and theorists since that scene first appeared in Jujutsu Kaisen 0. Those final private words exchanged between former friends who had been forced by circumstances and choices to become enemies, yet who retained enough of their original bond that even in death, tenderness could survive the devastation that ideology and trauma had wrought upon their connection. The visual narrative shows us Gojo's lips moving, shows us his posture of intimate proximity to someone he had just been forced to kill, but preserves the privacy of that final communication as something too sacred for public consumption. Geto's response, audible to those nearby, provides the only clue we have about the nature of what Gojo said to him in those final moments. "You should at least curse me in the end," he whispered, the words carrying both gratitude and gentle reproach, acknowledgement that, even facing death at the hands of his dearest friend, he was being shown mercy that his actions did not deserve, kindness that transcended the justice his crimes had earned. The phrase suggests that whatever Gojo said was not condemnation or anger, but something that honored their shared history rather than focusing on the terrible present that had brought them to this point. The most compelling theory about Gojo's final words emerges from careful analysis of the opening theme for the Hidden Inventory arc, Ao no Sumika, whose lyrics are written from Gojo's perspective and seem to contain echoes of that final conversation in their emotional content and specific phrasing. The song speaks of words that remain stuck in the throat, of voices that cannot be heard, of promises to meet again that transcend the apparent finality of death and separation. These lyrical elements align too perfectly with the visual evidence from that final scene to be mere coincidence. "We'll meet again" represents more than simple hope for reunion beyond death, though it certainly carries that meaning for someone whose Buddhist influences would naturally include concepts of rebirth and karma that might allow separated souls to find each other across multiple lifetimes. But in the context of Gojo's character development and his understanding of how bonds between people can survive even the most devastating betrayals, those words would represent his fundamental refusal to allow their friendship to be defined by its tragic ending rather than its beautiful beginning and middle years. The promise of reunion also reflects Gojo's growing understanding that death is not the absolute boundary it appears to be, that consciousness and connection can persist through forms that transcend individual mortality. His development of reverse curse technique had already demonstrated his ability to manipulate the boundary between life and death in ways that most sorcerers never achieved, and his philosophical evolution throughout the series shows increasing comfort with concepts of continuity that extend beyond the physical body and individual personality. But perhaps most significantly, "We'll meet again" would represent Gojo's determination not to carry hatred or resentment for the choices that had forced them to become enemies. His commitment to preserving the love that had defined their relationship during its best years, rather than allowing that love to be corrupted by the necessity of their final conflict. In promising future reunion, he was also promising to remember Geto as the idealistic young man who had shared his dreams of protecting innocent people, rather than the broken adult who had decided that those same people were the source of the problems they had dedicated their lives to solving. The throat imagery in Ao no Sumika speaks to the difficulty of expressing emotions that transcend ordinary language, feelings that are too complex and contradictory to be captured in simple words even when privacy allows for complete honesty. The love between Gojo and Geto had survived their philosophical divergence but could not survive the actions that divergence had produced. creating a situation where both men understood that their bond remained real, even as it became impossible to maintain in any practical sense. The voice that cannot be heard refers not just to the privacy of that final conversation, but to the broader tragedy of their failed communication throughout the period when intervention might still have been possible. So much of what went wrong between them stemmed from their inability to share their developing concerns and doubts with each other. The way that pride and protective instincts prevented them from seeking help when the psychological pressure of their responsibilities began to exceed their capacity to bear it alone. Geto's suggestion that Gojo should curse him reflects his understanding that mercy in that moment was both more and less than what justice demanded, that being shown kindness after committing atrocities created a different kind of burden than simple punishment would have imposed. To be cursed by someone you had betrayed would provide the clarity of appropriate consequence, while being forgiven by that same person created obligations that could never be fully repaid and guilt that could never be completely resolved. But Gojo's refusal to offer the curse that Geto requested demonstrates his evolution beyond simple concepts of justice and retribution towards something approaching the compassion that Buddhism identifies as the highest expression of wisdom. To curse someone is to wish for their suffering to continue and increase, while to forgive is to hope for their eventual liberation from the conditions that created their harmful actions. In those final moments, Gojo chose liberation over retribution, healing over justice, love over righteousness. The complexity of emotions that both men experienced during that final exchange reflects the tragic reality that people can remain connected by genuine affection, even after they have made choices that place them in fundamental opposition to each other. The friendship that had sustained them through their student years and early professional development had not been destroyed by their philosophical differences, but had been made impossible to maintain by the actions those differences had produced. The love remained real, even as the relationship became unsustainable. This preservation of emotional connection, despite intellectual opposition, represents one of the most psychologically sophisticated aspects of their relationship throughout the series. The way that personal affection and ideological disagreement could coexist without either fully cancelling the other. They could recognize each other as good people who had reached different conclusions about how to address the problems they both acknowledged, even as those different conclusions led them to take actions that made continued friendship impossible. The Ao no Sumika lyrics that speak of meeting again carry additional layers of meaning when considered in the context of Gojo's later development as a teacher and mentor. His determination to create conditions where the next generation might avoid the mistakes that had destroyed his own most important relationship. In promising to meet Geto again, he was also committing to becoming someone worthy of that reunion, to developing the wisdom and compassion that might allow him to guide others away from the isolation and extremism that had claimed his dearest friend. The educational philosophy that Gojo developed after losing Geto reflects his understanding that technical training without emotional support creates conditions where even the most well-intentioned individuals can be corrupted by the weight of their responsibilities and the trauma that comes from constant exposure to human suffering and evil. His teaching methods emphasize connection and mutual support, specifically because he had learned through bitter experience how dangerous it was for exceptionally powerful individuals to face their challenges alone. The promise to meet again thus becomes a commitment, not just to personal reunion, but to systemic change, to creating institutional conditions where future friendships might survive the pressures that had destroyed theirs. Gojo's work with students like Yuji, Megumi, and Nobara demonstrates his determination to provide the kind of guidance and support that he and Geto had lacked during their own development. Understanding that individual strength without communal wisdom leads inevitably to the kind of isolation that breeds extremism. But the deepest significance of those unspoken words lies in their demonstration that even absolute power cannot solve the fundamental problems of human existence, that strength without wisdom creates more suffering than it alleviates, and that the connections between people represent both the greatest source of meaning and the most vulnerable aspect of any life dedicated to service and protection. Gojo's promise to meet Geto again acknowledges that some bonds transcend even the most devastating betrayals, that love properly understood is not dependent on approval or agreement, but on recognition of shared fundamental humanity. The theoretical framework that emerges from analyzing this final conversation reveals how deeply Akutami understands the psychological costs of extraordinary responsibility and the ways that even the most carefully cultivated friendships can be destroyed by circumstances that exceed their capacity to adapt and survive. The tragedy of Gojo and Geto lies not in any failure of character or commitment, but in the impossibility of maintaining human connections while bearing inhuman burdens. The way that isolation becomes inevitable for those whose power and responsibility separate them from the ordinary experiences that allow normal relationships to develop and flourish. Their story serves as warning about the dangers of expecting individuals to carry collective responsibilities without providing them with adequate support systems and emotional resources, but also as testament to the resilience of genuine human connection and its capacity to survive even the most devastating circumstances when properly understood and honored. The words that Gojo spoke to the dying Geto represent not just personal farewell, but philosophical statement about the nature of love and its relationship to justice, forgiveness, and the hope for eventual redemption. The promise to meet again thus becomes more than personal hope, but universal aspiration. The belief that consciousness and connection can survive the apparent finality of death and separation, that love properly understood transcends the circumstances that seem to destroy it, and that reunion remains possible for those who learn to recognize each other, not through the roles they have been forced to play, but through the essential nature that survives every transformation and transcends every tragedy that might seem to separate what was meant to remain, forever joined in understanding and affection. The greatest mysteries often hide in plain sight, concealed not by elaborate deception, but by the simple inability of observers to recognize patterns that challenge their fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and causation. In the case of Yuji Itadori, whose existence has defied every conventional understanding of how cursed objects interact with human consciousness, the most profound secret may lie not in what he has become, but in what he has always been, a truth so elegantly simple that it has remained invisible beneath layers of more complex speculation and analysis. The theory that Yuji himself represents Sukuna's final finger emerges from careful examination of the circumstances surrounding his birth and the extraordinary capabilities he displayed long before consuming any cursed objects, abilities that suggested supernatural influence, operating at levels that transcended normal human potential. His physical strength, which exceeded that of most trained sorcerers despite his complete lack of formal education in cursed energy manipulation, pointed toward enhancement that began before his conscious involvement with the Jujutsu world, rather than developing as a consequence of his later experiences with Sukuna's influence. Kenjaku's presence at the time of Yuji's conception represents more than coincidental timing, indicating deliberate intervention designed to create specific outcomes through manipulation of factors that would shape the child's fundamental nature from the moment of cellular division. The experiments that Kenjaku conducted on Yuji's mother while she carried him were not random investigations, but systematic implementation of theories about how cursed objects might be integrated into human development at the most basic biological level, creating fusion that transcended the normal boundaries between curse and vessel. The process of incorporating a finger into the developing fetus would require techniques that operated at the intersection of cursed energy, manipulation, and biological engineering. Understanding of how supernatural forces could influence genetic expression and cellular development in ways that created enhancement rather than destruction. Rather than simply placing the finger within the womb, Kenjaku would have needed to break it down into its essential cursed energy components and integrate those elements into the child's developing nervous system, skeletal structure, and spiritual matrix. This integration would explain not just Yuji's extraordinary physical capabilities, but his unique psychological resilience, his capacity to maintain individual consciousness, despite sharing mental space with an entity whose presence should have overwhelmed his developing personality long before he reached adolescence. The finger's influence, distributed throughout his entire being rather than concentrated in a single location, would provide him with intimate understanding of Sukuna's nature, while also granting him the spiritual strength necessary to resist complete domination by that same consciousness. The pink hair that both Yuji and Sukuna's original form display represents more than aesthetic similarity, serving as visible marker of the connection that exists between them at levels that transcend simple vessel and curse relationships. Hair color in Japanese cultural tradition often carries symbolic significance related to spiritual nature and supernatural influence, and the specific shade that both characters share suggests genetic or magical connection that operates through mechanisms more fundamental than temporary possession or conscious technique application. Kenjaku's reference to Yuji as "it" during conversations with other characters takes on new significance when viewed through the lens of this theory, suggesting that he does not consider Yuji to be entirely human, but rather a hybrid creation that combines human consciousness with cursed object essence in ways that create something unprecedented in Jujutsu history. The term reflects not casual dehumanization but technical precision, acknowledgement that Yuji represents a new category of existence that transcends traditional boundaries between human and curse, living person, and supernatural artifact. The ease with which Yuji suppresses Sukuna's attempts to take control of their shared body becomes comprehensible when understood as the result of lifelong coexistence rather than sudden imposition of foreign consciousness upon unwilling host. Having grown up with Sukuna's influence as a constant presence in his development, Yuji would have naturally developed psychological defenses and spiritual techniques that allowed him to maintain autonomy while benefiting from the enhanced capabilities that came with their fundamental connection. This theory also explains the protective instincts that Sukuna occasionally displays toward Yuji despite his general contempt for human life, and his stated desire to eliminate everyone who might pose a threat to his eventual freedom. If Yuji represents not just a vessel, but an essential part of Sukuna's own being that has achieved independent consciousness, then harming Yuji would constitute a form of self-destruction that even the King of Curses would find strategically inadvisable and emotionally complex. The paper cut that appeared on Sukuna's finger after his battle with Yuji and Maki represents damage that his renowned regenerative abilities could not heal, suggesting that the wound was inflicted through methods that transcended normal physical or cursed energy attacks. The fact that such a minor injury could persist on someone whose healing capabilities had previously restored much more severe damage points toward techniques that operate at fundamental levels of existence, affecting not just the body, but the essential nature of what makes regeneration possible. The theory that Yuji subconsciously used cleave to create this unhealable wound demonstrates his intuitive access to Sukuna's techniques at levels that bypass conscious understanding or formal training. His ability to channel powers that should remain beyond his reach through connection that operates at deeper levels than simple proximity or exposure. This subconscious technique use suggests that the boundary between Yuji's abilities and Sukuna's has never been as clear as either character consciously recognizes. The development of cleave as an unconscious response to threat would represent the kind of automatic defense mechanism that might emerge when someone with integrated cursed object essence faces mortal danger, the way that survival instincts could trigger access to abilities that remain dormant during normal circumstances. The fact that Yuji was able to damage Sukuna using Sukuna's own technique creates a paradox that can only be resolved by understanding their relationship as something more intimate than temporary cohabitation. The irreparable nature of the damage suggests that Yuji's version of cleave operates through principles that differ from Sukuna's conscious application of the same technique, perhaps because his subconscious use accesses the ability at its source level rather than through the filtered understanding that comes with deliberate technique activation. This raw access to the technique's fundamental principles could allow him to inflict damage that even Sukuna cannot comprehend or counter using his normal regenerative processes. But the paper-cut theory extends beyond simple technique application into questions about identity and consciousness that challenge every assumption about the nature of individual existence and the boundaries between self and other. If Yuji can damage Sukuna using abilities that should belong exclusively to the King of Curses, then the distinction between them may be far less absolute than either character understands, suggesting fusion at levels that transcend conscious awareness or voluntary control. The soul-swapping abilities that some theorists attribute to Yuji represent a logical extension of his fundamental nature as someone whose consciousness has learned to coexist with and partially merge with another entity of enormous power and complexity. The techniques that would allow him to exchange consciousness with other people might emerge naturally from his lifelong experience of managing multiple awareness streams within a single physical form, understanding of how spiritual essence can be separated from and reunited with material bodies. The book that Choso provided to Yuji, containing Yuki's research on the relationship between body and soul, would serve as theoretical framework that allows him to understand processes that he has been unconsciously practicing throughout his entire existence. The scientific analysis of how consciousness relates to physical form would provide him with vocabulary and conceptual tools necessary to develop conscious control over abilities that had previously operated only through instinctive response to extreme circumstances. The potential for body-swapping techniques opens possibilities that extend far beyond simple tactical advantage in combat situations, suggesting abilities that could fundamentally alter the strategic landscape of ongoing conflicts, while raising profound philosophical questions about the nature of identity and the continuity of consciousness across different physical forms. If consciousness can be transferred between bodies without loss of essential self, then traditional concepts of individual identity and personal responsibility become complex in ways that challenge legal, moral, and spiritual frameworks. But perhaps most significantly, these theories about Yuji's true nature point toward broader questions about the nature of power and its relationship to identity, the ways that extraordinary capabilities might emerge not through external enhancement but through recognition and development of potential that has always existed within apparently ordinary individuals. His story suggests that the boundary between human and supernatural may be far more fluid than traditional Jujutsu understanding acknowledges, that consciousness itself might be capable of adaptations that transcend every category that previous generations have used to organize their understanding of what is possible. The implications of Yuji as Sukuna's final finger extend beyond individual character development into questions about destiny and choice. The extent to which his extraordinary nature represents predetermined fate versus conscious decision-making that shapes outcomes through will and determination, rather than genetic or magical inevitability. His ability to maintain individual agency despite his fundamental connection to forces that transcend human comprehension suggests that consciousness itself possesses resilience and creative potential that can transform even the most challenging circumstances into opportunities for growth and positive contribution. The true magnitude of Sukuna's power may lie not in any single devastating technique, but in his capacity to access an arsenal of abilities accumulated across centuries of conquest and worship, each stolen method preserved within the architectural marvel that appears whenever he manifests his domain expansion. The malevolent shrine that materializes around him during combat is not merely a symbolic representation of his authority, but a functional repository where the cursed techniques of countless sorcerers have been catalogued and stored like sacred artifacts in a temple dedicated to the preservation of power itself. The chant of open that precedes Sukuna's deployment of techniques beyond his basic slashing abilities suggests a process more complex than simple technique activation, indicating that he is accessing a collection of preserved methods rather than drawing upon abilities that originate within his own cursed energy signature. The word itself carries implications of unlocking, revealing, or providing access to something that exists in contained form, waiting to be released when circumstances require capabilities that exceed his fundamental slashing techniques of cleave and dismantle. The historical worship that surrounded Sukuna during the Heian era was characterized not by the fearful submission typically offered to malevolent spirits, but by reverent presentation of crafted objects, artistic achievements, and demonstrations of technical mastery that suggested his followers understood him as someone who valued skill and creativity above simple power or destruction. The rituals performed in his honor were elaborate affairs that showcased human potential, realized through dedication and artistry, offerings that reflected understanding of what would please someone whose aesthetic sensibilities had been refined through centuries of exposure to the finest achievements of human civilization. The shrine architecture that appears during his domain expansion bears striking resemblance to repository buildings found at ancient Japanese temples, structures specifically designed for the preservation and protection of sacred objects whose value transcended their material composition. These buildings were constructed according to principles that emphasized both security and accessibility, allowing precious items to remain safely stored while remaining available for ceremonial use when appropriate circumstances arose. But unlike traditional shrines that house static artifacts, Sukuna's domain contains living techniques that retain their essential properties, despite being separated from their original practitioners. Cursed energy patterns that have been preserved in forms that allow them to be accessed and deployed by someone who possesses sufficient understanding of their fundamental principles and adequate power to sustain their activation. The preservation process would require techniques that operate at the intersection of cursed energy, manipulation, and spiritual archaeology, methods for extracting the essential patterns that define specific abilities while maintaining their integrity across centuries of storage. The factory-like appearance of certain areas within the malevolent shrine suggests systematic organization of these preserved techniques according to categories that reflect their tactical applications, power requirements, and compatibility with Sukuna's fundamental cursed energy signature. The most frequently accessed abilities would be stored in easily reached locations, while more specialized or dangerous techniques might be relegated to secure areas that require additional authorization or preparation before they can be safely deployed in combat situations. The mechanism by which Sukuna originally acquired these techniques during the Heian era would have involved more than simple theft or violent appropriation, requiring understanding of how cursed energy patterns could be extracted from living practitioners without immediately destroying the source of the abilities he sought to preserve. The process would demand not just overwhelming power, but sophisticated knowledge of how individual consciousness relates to technique development and the ways that abilities could be transferred between practitioners while maintaining their essential characteristics. The worship rituals that provided him with access to these techniques were likely voluntary demonstrations by sorcerers who sought his approval or protection, individuals who willingly displayed their abilities in exchange for association with his power and influence. The offerings of technical mastery that characterized these ceremonies would provide him with opportunities to study abilities at close range, while their practitioners remained alive and capable of demonstrating the full range of their practitioners' capabilities under various conditions. But the most sophisticated aspects of these acquisition ceremonies would have involved the creation of technique seeds, concentrated patterns of cursed energy that contained the essential information necessary to recreate specific abilities without requiring the continued presence of their original practitioners. These seeds would function as detailed blueprints that preserved not just the mechanical aspects of technique activation, but the philosophical frameworks and emotional states that made successful deployment possible for practitioners who understood their fundamental principles. The storage system within the malevolent shrine would need to maintain these technique seeds in forms that prevented degradation or corruption while allowing for rapid access when combat situations required immediate deployment of specific capabilities. The organization would reflect both practical considerations about tactical utility and aesthetic principles that honored the artistic achievement that each preserved technique represented, creating a collection that served simultaneously as weapon, museum, and testament to human creative potential. The fire techniques that Sukuna displayed during his battle with Jogo represent just one example of abilities that exceed his fundamental slashing techniques, suggesting access to powers that originated with practitioners who specialized in thermal manipulation and whose understanding of combustion principles allowed them to create effects that transcended ordinary fire-based attacks. The sophistication of these techniques indicates that they were developed by masters whose dedication to their craft had produced abilities of exceptional refinement and power. The integration of stolen techniques with Sukuna's fundamental abilities would require understanding of how different cursed energy signatures could be harmonized without creating interference patterns that might reduce the effectiveness of either the borrowed techniques or his original slashing abilities. The process would demand not just technical knowledge, but philosophical flexibility that allowed him to adopt the worldviews and emotional frameworks that made specific techniques possible while maintaining his essential identity and core capabilities. But perhaps most significantly, the shrine system suggests that Sukuna's power has always been fundamentally collective rather than individual, representing the accumulated achievements of human civilization in the realm of cursed energy manipulation, rather than the isolated development of a single practitioner, no matter how talented or dedicated. His status as the King of Curses reflects not just personal strength, but his role as repository and curator of humanity's greatest achievements in supernatural technique development. The evolution beyond human categorization that some theorists attribute to Sukuna becomes more comprehensible when understood in the context of his role as living archive of human potential, someone who has absorbed so many different approaches to power and technique that his essential nature has transcended the limitations that constrain ordinary practitioners to single specializations or narrow ranges of capability. His 4 arms and 2 faces might represent not just physical evolution, but symbolic acknowledgement of his capacity to simultaneously embody multiple philosophical approaches to power and its application. The angel's reference to him as the disgraced one takes on additional layers of meaning when considered in the context of his theft of techniques that were freely offered by worshippers who trusted him to honor their contributions, rather than simply appropriating their life's work for his own purposes. The disgrace lies not in his evolution beyond human form, but in his betrayal of the relationship between teacher and student, master and disciple, that should have governed his acquisition of abilities that others had developed through decades of dedicated practice and spiritual development. The similarities between Sukuna's evolved form and Master Tengen's appearance suggest parallel processes of transcendence that moved both beings beyond ordinary human limitations, while preserving their fundamental connection to human civilization and values. But where Tengen's evolution serves protective purposes that preserve human society through barrier techniques and guidance, Sukuna's transformation has created someone who views human achievement as raw material to be collected and deployed according to his personal aesthetic preferences, rather than honored as expressions of consciousness worthy of respect and preservation in their original contexts. The theoretical framework that emerges from this analysis reveals Sukuna as both the ultimate expression of human potential in cursed energy manipulation and its greatest perversion, someone who has achieved mastery through appropriation rather than development, accumulation rather than creation, consumption rather than contribution. His shrine represents simultaneously the pinnacle of human achievement in supernatural techniques and the ultimate violation of the relationships that should govern how such achievements are preserved and transmitted across generations. The implications of this technique storage system extend beyond individual character analysis into questions about the nature of knowledge and its relationship to power, the ways that abilities developed through dedication and sacrifice can be appropriated by those who possess sufficient strength to take what others have created without understanding or honoring the development process that made such creation possible. Sukuna's shrine serves as warning about what happens when power becomes separated from the wisdom and character development that should accompany its acquisition and deployment. The cyclical nature of catastrophic events that reshape human civilization suggests patterns that extend far beyond the limited perspective of any single generation, rhythms that operate according to temporal scales that make individual lifetimes appear as brief moments within larger movements of cosmic significance. The culling game that Kenjaku orchestrated in the contemporary era may represent not innovation but repetition, the latest iteration of conflicts that have erupted with predictable regularity whenever the accumulated tension between human civilization and supernatural forces reaches levels that demand resolution through systematic violence, transformation. The evidence for previous culling games lies scattered throughout the historical record, like fragments of a vast mirror that once reflected the complete picture of humanity's relationship with cursed energy and the periodic crises that have shaped the development of Jujutsu society across millennia of hidden conflict. These fragments suggest that the current game represents neither the first nor likely the last such contest, but rather one movement in a symphony of destruction and renewal that has played out countless times as conscious beings have struggled to find sustainable balance between power and wisdom, individual ambition and collective survival. Drew's designation as a veteran experiencing his second incarnation provides perhaps the most compelling evidence that the incarnation process itself has been employed before, that the technique of binding ancient souls to contemporary bodies represents established methodology rather than recent innovation. The terminology surrounding his status suggests institutional memory of previous events that required similar measures, conflicts significant enough to justify the resurrection of legendary sorcerers whose capabilities exceeded those available within the current generation of practitioners. The specific reference to second incarnation implies not just previous use of the technique, but systematic record-keeping that tracked individual participants across multiple applications, suggesting bureaucratic infrastructure that had developed standardized procedures for managing large-scale resurrection programs. Such infrastructure would require decades or centuries to develop and refine, indicating that the incarnation process had been employed sufficiently often to justify the creation of specialized institutions dedicated to its administration and oversight. But perhaps most significantly, Drew's characterization as someone whose power single-handedly conquered Japan during the civil wars that occurred nearly 2,000 years ago places his original lifetime within the historical period when Sukuna also achieved legendary status, suggesting that the Heian era represented not just a time of individual exceptional sorcerers, but a systematic conflict that required the deployment of multiple legendary figures whose capabilities exceeded anything that normal historical processes would be likely to produce through natural development. The convergence of multiple legendary figures during the Heian era points towards circumstances that demanded extraordinary responses, conditions that made the emergence of beings like Sukuna and Drew not coincidental, but necessary for the resolution of conflicts that threatened the fundamental stability of human civilization in its relationship with supernatural forces. The density of exceptional individuals during this period suggests artificial concentration rather than natural distribution, the result of deliberate processes that called forth legendary capabilities when ordinary strength proved insufficient. The 1,000-year gap between the Heian era and the contemporary culling game aligns suspiciously well with cyclical patterns that appear throughout various mythological and historical traditions, suggesting that the forces which precipitate these contests operate according to temporal rhythms that reflect deeper patterns in how consciousness and power interact across extended time periods. The millennium represents not arbitrary duration but meaningful cycle, the time required for accumulated tensions to reach levels that demand systematic resolution through organized conflict. Tengen's role in these cyclical events becomes more complex when viewed through the lens of recurring crises that require management by beings whose perspective encompasses periods far longer than individual human lifetimes. Her immortality and barrier maintenance responsibilities would provide her with unique understanding of how supernatural tensions build over centuries and the kinds of interventions that become necessary when peaceful resolution proves insufficient to address conflicts that threaten the fundamental stability of the relationship between human civilization and cursed energy. The theory that Tengen and Kenjaku collaborated during the original culling game suggests a partnership that was formed in response to crisis conditions that exceeded either individuals' capacity to address independently, circumstances that required the combination of Tengen's protective capabilities with Kenjaku's experimental approach to consciousness manipulation and strategic planning. Their cooperation would represent pragmatic alliance rather than philosophical agreement, recognition that their different approaches to managing supernatural forces could complement each other when facing existential threats. But the apparent deterioration of their relationship over the intervening millennium suggests that their original collaboration was undermined by fundamental differences in how they understood the relationship between individual consciousness and collective welfare, disagreements that may have been suppressed during the crisis that brought them together, but which emerged with destructive force once immediate dangers had been addressed, and long-term planning became the primary consideration. The betrayal that likely ended their partnership would have occurred gradually rather than through dramatic confrontation. The slow recognition that their different approaches to consciousness and power were leading them toward incompatible conclusions about how human civilization should develop in its relationship with supernatural forces. Tengen's commitment to preservation and stability would have conflicted increasingly with Kenjaku's experimental approach that viewed individual consciousness as raw material for larger projects aimed at fundamental transformation of human potential. The geographic patterns that connect ancient battlefields with contemporary culling game locations suggest institutional memory that preserved knowledge of sites where previous conflicts had achieved their most significant outcomes, places where the intersection of temporal cycles and spatial configuration created conditions particularly suitable for large-scale supernatural contests. These locations would retain resonance that made them naturally attractive for similar events, spiritual geography that channeled and amplified the forces that such conflicts required for successful resolution. The barrier systems that Tengen maintains across Japan would serve not just protective functions but archival purposes, preserving information about previous conflicts and the techniques that had proven effective in managing their outcomes. The barriers themselves might contain embedded records of past events, spiritual documentation that could be accessed by individuals with sufficient understanding of how information could be encoded within supernatural structures and retrieved when circumstances required historical guidance. The incarnation techniques that allow ancient sorcerers to return in contemporary bodies represent refinements of methods that were developed and tested during previous cycles. Accumulated understanding of how consciousness could be preserved across death and reintegrated with living systems when conditions demanded capabilities that exceeded those available within the current generation. The sophistication of these techniques suggests centuries of development and application, systematic research that treated consciousness transfer as engineering problem rather than mystical phenomenon. But the most profound implications of cyclical culling games relate to questions about progress and development, whether human civilization is advancing toward greater wisdom and capability, or simply repeating patterns that reflect fundamental limitations in how conscious beings relate to power and each other. The recurrence of similar conflicts suggests either failure to learn from previous experience, or the existence of forces that operate beyond human capacity to influence through conventional means. The selection criteria that determine which ancient sorcerers are chosen for incarnation during each cycle would reflect accumulated understanding of which combinations of personalities and capabilities had proven most effective in Munsi, achieving resolution of previous conflicts, strategic decisions based on analysis of past outcomes, and assessment of contemporary conditions that might require different approaches or similar solutions applied under changed circumstances. The 1,000-year intervals between major cycles might represent not arbitrary duration but the time required for human civilization to develop sufficient spiritual and technical capability to support the kind of large-scale, supernatural conflicts that these games represent, periods necessary for the accumulation of cursed energy reserves and the development of institutional infrastructure that could manage the logistical requirements of systematic incarnation and contest administration. The role of Sukuna as recurring participant, rather than mere historical figure, suggests that some individuals achieve forms of consciousness that transcend normal cyclical patterns, becoming permanent features of the landscape rather than temporary participants who appear and disappear according to external scheduling. His preservation across multiple cycles would reflect not just personal power, but significance that makes his continued existence necessary for the proper functioning of whatever forces govern these recurring conflicts. The liminal space between life and death reveals itself to be far more complex and negotiable than ordinary understanding suggests. A territory where consciousness can persist in forms that transcend the apparent finality of physical dissolution, while remaining connected to possibilities for return under circumstances that align proper technique with sufficient will and favorable conditions. The mysteries surrounding the fates of several characters whose deaths appeared certain suggest that the boundary between existence and non-existence operates according to principles that allow for suspension, preservation, and eventual restoration when the cosmic timing proves appropriate for such miraculous interventions. Nobara Kujisaki's encounter with Mahito's idol transfiguration technique should have resulted in immediate and irreversible death, the kind of soul-level damage that exceeds the healing capabilities of even the most advanced reverse curse technique practitioners, because it operates by fundamentally altering the essential nature of what makes individual consciousness possible, rather than simply causing physical injury that can be repaired through supernatural intervention. The technique works by reshaping the soul itself, transforming the spiritual foundation that gives form and coherence to both physical body and individual personality, in ways that should make restoration impossible once the process reaches completion. But the mysterious sorcerer who appeared immediately after Nobara's apparent death introduced possibilities that challenge every assumption about the irreversible nature of soul manipulation damage, speaking of slim chances for survival that suggested techniques or conditions that might allow consciousness to persist, even after idol transfiguration had completed its devastating work. The fact that this individual appeared only for this single scene, with no prior introduction or subsequent development, suggests that his presence served specific narrative purpose rather than casual plot convenience, that his abilities represented genuine possibility rather than false hope. The technique that this unnamed sorcerer possessed would need to operate at levels that transcend normal categories of healing or restoration, perhaps involving the preservation of essential soul patterns in forms that could survive even the complete destruction of their original configuration. Such abilities might allow consciousness to be maintained in suspended states, while damaged spiritual architecture was slowly reconstructed according to preserved blueprints that captured the essential characteristics of individual identity and personal history. The process of such reconstruction would require not just technical mastery, but profound understanding of how consciousness relates to spiritual form, the ways that individual identity can be maintained across transformations that should destroy every aspect of personal continuity. The sorcerer would need to understand souls not as fixed structures, but as dynamic patterns that could be preserved in essence, while their specific manifestations underwent complete renewal according to principles that honored original intention, while adapting to changed circumstances. But perhaps most significantly, the slim chance that this mysterious figure mentioned suggests that even his extraordinary abilities required favorable conditions that existed only briefly after the initial damage occurred, windows of opportunity that would close permanently if intervention was delayed beyond critical thresholds. The timing would need to account for factors including the victim's spiritual resilience, the completeness of the soul manipulation, and the availability of environmental conditions that could support the kind of suspended animation that such preservation would require. The theory that Nobara's consciousness was preserved in dormant state rather than eliminated entirely offers hope that aligns with the broader patterns of death and resurrection that characterize the series. The way that apparent endings frequently transform into new beginnings when viewed from perspectives that encompass longer temporal scales and deeper understanding of how consciousness relates to physical manifestation. Her potential return would represent not violation of established rules, but demonstration of possibilities that exist at the margins of what most practitioners understand about life and death. Uraume's survival across more than 1,000 years presents a different but related mystery. The question of how individual consciousness can maintain continuity across temporal spans that should exceed any technique's capacity to preserve coherent identity. The ice-based abilities that define their curse technique suggest methods for achieving suspension that operates through principles analogous to cryogenic preservation, using extreme cold to slow or halt the biological and spiritual processes that normally limit consciousness to relatively brief periods of physical manifestation. The scientific principles underlying cryogenic preservation focus on the relationship between temperature and molecular activity, the way that sufficient reduction in thermal energy can effectively stop the chemical processes that cause aging and decay while preserving cellular structure, in forms that allow for eventual restoration when warming occurs under controlled conditions. The application of such principles to spiritual preservation would require understanding of how consciousness relates to the physical systems that support it, the ways that individual identity might be maintained across periods of near-complete metabolic suspension. But spiritual cryogenics would need to account for factors that purely physical preservation cannot address: the preservation of memories, personality patterns, and essential identity characteristics that transcend simple biological function and require techniques that can maintain coherent spiritual architecture across centuries of dormancy. The process would demand not just physical preservation, but spiritual discipline that could maintain conscious continuity, even when normal awareness was suspended to levels that approached complete unconsciousness. The ice techniques that Uraume employs demonstrate mastery over thermal dynamics that exceeds anything achievable through normal understanding of how temperature manipulation works, suggesting abilities that operate through direct control over molecular motion, rather than simple generation of cold through conventional thermodynamic processes. Such control would allow for precise regulation of biological processes at cellular and subcellular levels, creating conditions where aging and decay could be halted without causing the kind of tissue damage that normally results from extreme temperature exposure. The preservation process would require careful balance between suspension deep enough to prevent aging and awareness, sufficient to maintain spiritual coherence across extended periods of dormancy, creating states that exist at the boundary between life and death while preserving the essential characteristics that make eventual restoration possible. The technique would need to maintain minimal consciousness that could monitor environmental conditions and prepare for awakening when circumstances became favorable for return to active existence. But perhaps most remarkably, Uraume's preservation would need to account for the psychological challenges of maintaining stable identity across centuries of isolation, the ways that extended separation from normal social interaction and environmental stimulation could erode personality and memory in ways that would make successful restoration meaningless, even if physical preservation succeeded completely. The mental discipline required for such endurance would exceed anything that normal human psychology could sustain without specialized training or supernatural enhancement. The motivation that sustained Uraume through centuries of voluntary suspension reflects dedication that transcends normal categories of loyalty or devotion, commitment to Sukuna's eventual resurrection that transformed personal extinction into temporary inconvenience rather than permanent loss. Such dedication suggests relationship dynamics that operate according to principles deeper than simple master-servant hierarchies, connections that create meaning sufficient to justify sacrifices that most individuals would find psychologically impossible to contemplate, much less successfully implement. The timing of Uraume's awakening in relation to Sukuna's return indicates either supernatural sensitivity to their master's spiritual status or systematic monitoring of conditions that would signal appropriate moments for ending self-imposed dormancy, suggesting awareness that persisted throughout the preservation period rather than complete unconsciousness that would require external triggers for restoration. The precision of this timing points towards suspended consciousness rather than simple preservation of physical form. The broader implications of successful long-term preservation techniques suggest possibilities for addressing mortality that extend far beyond individual cases, methods that might allow exceptional individuals to survive across historical periods when their capabilities are not immediately needed, while remaining available for circumstances that require intervention by consciousness that has achieved levels of development that exceed contemporary limitations. Such techniques would transform death from absolute boundary into strategic choice, suspension, rather than termination. The philosophical questions raised by consciousness preservation across extended temporal periods challenge fundamental assumptions about identity and continuity, the ways that individual personality relates to physical embodiment and temporal experience. The preservation of consciousness across centuries of suspension suggests that essential identity exists independently of the normal flow of experience that most people assume is necessary for coherent selfhood. That personality and memory can maintain coherence even when separated from the environmental interaction that usually defines conscious existence. But these preservation techniques also raise questions about the nature of sacrifice and dedication, the kinds of commitment that can sustain individuals through experiences that approach complete dissolution of normal existence, while maintaining focus on objectives that transcend immediate personal welfare. The willingness to accept centuries of suspended animation in service of another's eventual return demonstrates forms of loyalty that challenge ordinary understanding of how individual motivation relates to collective purpose and the preservation of values that extend beyond immediate personal survival or satisfaction. The violation of individual identity through the appropriation of physical form represents perhaps the most profound horror imaginable, the transformation of someone's body into a vessel for consciousness that bears no relationship to the original inhabitant's values, memories, or intentions. The theoretical possibility that Kenjaku might claim Nobara's preserved corpse as his next host creates nightmare scenarios that extend far beyond tactical considerations into realms of existential violation that challenge every assumption about the sanctity of individual identity and the boundaries that should protect consciousness from unwanted invasion and manipulation. The mechanics of Kenjaku's body-swapping technique require not just the death of potential hosts, but the preservation of their physical forms in conditions that allow for successful integration with his ancient consciousness, creating demand for corpses that retain sufficient spiritual and biological integrity to support the complex process of consciousness transfer across the boundary between life and death. Nobara's body, damaged by Mahito's idol transfiguration, but potentially preserved through the mysterious sorcerer's intervention, would represent exactly the kind of opportunity that Kenjaku's methodology requires for continued operation. The psychological warfare that would result from Kenjaku inhabiting Nobara's form extends beyond simple impersonation into systematic torture, designed to exploit every emotional connection that she had developed with her classmates and colleagues, transforming beloved memories into sources of ongoing trauma through the perversion of familiar appearance and mannerisms by consciousness that represents everything she opposed during her life. The sight of her face speaking words that betray her values would create wounds that exceed any physical damage that conventional combat could inflict. But the tactical advantages that Nobara's straw doll technique would provide to someone of Kenjaku's experience and malevolence represent considerations that transcend emotional manipulation, offering capabilities that could fundamentally alter the strategic balance of ongoing conflicts through applications that she never imagined and would never have approved. Her technique, which operated through sympathetic connections between target and effigy, could become instrument of assassination and manipulation that operates across vast distances with precision that makes conventional defenses irrelevant. The corruption of her technique through Kenjaku's application would transform methods that she developed for protection and justice into tools for systematic oppression and control, perverting the intention behind her abilities, while exploiting their mechanical effectiveness for purposes that represent complete betrayal of everything she believed about the proper relationship between power and responsibility. The violation would be not just personal but philosophical, the transformation of protective technique into instrument of domination. The theoretical framework for understanding consciousness transfer reveals the profound complexity of what makes individual identity possible, the intricate relationships between memory, personality, spiritual essence, and physical embodiment that create the coherent sense of self that most people take for granted until circumstances force recognition of how fragile and contingent such coherence actually proves to be under extreme conditions. Kenjaku's technique operates by maintaining his essential consciousness while adapting to new physical forms that retain traces of their original inhabitants' capabilities and characteristics. But the process involves not just overlay of new consciousness upon existing physical form, but integration that requires understanding of how individual identity relates to biological systems, spiritual architecture, and accumulated experience that shapes personality development across lifetimes of interaction with environmental factors that create unique patterns of response and adaptation. The successful transfer demands techniques that can maintain essential identity while adapting to new physical constraints and opportunities. Yuta's binding technique, if the theoretical analysis proves accurate, represents a fundamentally different approach to consciousness interaction that honors the autonomy and dignity of other beings while creating connections that enhance rather than violate individual identity. His ability to form authentic bonds with cursed spirits and channel their techniques through cooperative relationship rather than domination demonstrates possibilities for power sharing that transcends the predatory dynamics that characterize most interactions between different forms of consciousness. The ring that connected Yuta to Rika served not as instrument of control but as symbol of mutual consent, physical representation of emotional bond that both participants entered voluntarily and maintained through ongoing choice rather than compulsion or manipulation. The power that emerged from their connection reflected not appropriation of her abilities, but collaboration that allowed both consciousnesses to achieve capabilities that neither could access independently, while preserving their essential identities and individual agency. The theoretical extension of Yuta's technique to other relationships suggests possibilities for consciousness interaction that could revolutionize understanding of how individual identity relates to collective capability. Methods for achieving extraordinary effects through cooperation rather than domination, partnership rather than possession, enhancement rather than replacement of existing consciousness, with foreign awareness that serves different values and intentions. But the authentic bonds that make such techniques possible require emotional development and moral maturity that most practitioners never achieve. the kind of psychological integration that allows genuine empathy and respect for other forms of consciousness, even when they differ dramatically from familiar patterns of thought and feeling. The technique demands not just technical skill, but character development that can sustain cooperative relationships across differences that might otherwise create conflict or misunderstanding. The philosophical implications of consciousness transfer and binding techniques extend into fundamental questions about the nature of identity and its relationship to physical embodiment, the ways that individual awareness relates to the biological and spiritual systems that support conscious experience. The possibility of transferring consciousness between bodies or sharing awareness across multiple forms challenges, but assumptions about the boundaries of self and other that inform most approaches to ethics, law, and social organization. The horror of unwilling consciousness transfer lies not just in the violation of individual autonomy, but in the corruption of everything that makes personal identity meaningful. The transformation of unique perspective and accumulated experience into raw material for projects that serve alien purposes and values. The victim's memories, relationships, and capabilities become tools for achieving objectives that betray everything they valued during their original existence, creating forms of betrayal that extend beyond death into perversion of legacy and meaning. But the possibilities for voluntary consciousness interaction suggest alternatives that honor individual dignity while creating opportunities for collaboration that transcends normal limitations on what single awareness can achieve or understand. The development of techniques that allow authentic cooperation between different forms of consciousness could create capabilities that serve collective welfare while preserving the essential characteristics that make individual identity valuable and worthy of protection. The preservation of consciousness across different physical forms raises questions about continuity and change that challenge ordinary understanding of what makes someone the same person across time and transformation. The extent to which personality, memory, and essential identity can survive radical alterations in physical embodiment suggests that consciousness itself might be far more adaptable and resilient than normal experience would indicate, capable of maintaining coherence across changes that seem to threaten everything that defines individual existence. The ethical frameworks that govern consciousness, transfer, and binding techniques would need to account for factors that transcend normal categories of consent and autonomy, principles that honor the fundamental dignity of all forms of awareness while acknowledging the legitimate needs that might justify extraordinary measures under extreme circumstances. The development of such frameworks requires understanding of consciousness that extends beyond current scientific and philosophical knowledge into realms where theory meets practice in ways that demand both technical precision and moral wisdom. The parallels between Satoru Gojo's spiritual journey and the path toward enlightenment that defines Buddhist tradition reveal themselves not through casual resemblance, but through deliberate symbolic architecture that suggests his apparent death represents transformation rather than termination, evolution beyond physical limitations, rather than simple cessation of existence. The iconography that surrounds his character throughout the series draws upon imagery and concepts that have represented spiritual awakening for millennia, creating theoretical framework that supports the possibility of return through means that transcend ordinary categories of life and death. The gesture that Gojo performed during his moment of supreme confidence, pointing one finger toward heaven and another toward earth, directly mirrors the mudra that Buddha is said to have displayed immediately upon his birth, when divine awareness first entered human form and proclaimed its recognition of cosmic significance that transcended ordinary mortal existence. The positioning of his hands was not casual display of arrogance, but conscious invocation of iconography that represents the moment when individual consciousness achieves perfect integration with universal principles, becoming embodiment of enlightened awareness, rather than merely exceptional individual. The words that accompanied this gesture, his declaration that throughout heaven and earth he alone was the honored one, represent not boastful claim of personal superiority, but recognition of the fundamental truth that Buddha proclaimed upon entering the world, the understanding that individual consciousness, when properly developed, becomes expression of cosmic principle rather than separate entity competing with other forms of awareness for limited resources or recognition. The phrase carries implications that extend far beyond personal achievement into acknowledgement of universal potential that exists within all conscious beings. But perhaps most significantly, the timing of this gesture occurred during Gojo's period of maximum confidence and apparent invincibility, before the humbling experiences that would eventually lead to his defeat and apparent death, suggesting that his spiritual journey was still incomplete despite his overwhelming technical capabilities. The Buddhist framework indicates that such declarations of realization must be followed by periods of testing and refinement that prove whether understanding has achieved sufficient depth to survive challenges that threaten everything the Padme practitioner believes about their own nature and capabilities. The age at which Gojo encountered his final battle, just one day short of 29 years, aligns precisely with the traditional age at which Buddha began his systematic pursuit of enlightenment after abandoning the comfortable illusions that had sustained his earlier existence. The symbolic precision of this timing suggests narrative intention that extends beyond coincidence into deliberate invocation of spiritual patterns that govern how consciousness evolves through encounters with suffering, limitation, and the recognition that even extraordinary power cannot eliminate the fundamental conditions that create human dissatisfaction and conflict. The 29-year threshold represents not arbitrary number but crucial transition point where the limitations of worldly achievement become undeniably apparent even to those who have achieved unprecedented success according to conventional measures of power, wealth, or recognition. It marks the moment when external accomplishment reveals its inability to provide lasting satisfaction or protection from the existential questions that arise when consciousness develops sufficient depth to recognize the temporary nature of all conditioned existence. Buddha's departure from palace life at 29 was precipitated by his first encounters with aging, sickness, and death, realities that his privileged existence had previously shielded him from experiencing directly. Similarly, Gojo's defeat at the hands of Sukuna forced him to confront limitations that his extraordinary abilities had allowed him to avoid acknowledging throughout his career. As the strongest sorcerer, creating conditions where spiritual development could proceed beyond the plateaus that accompany even exceptional worldly achievement. The airport scene that followed Gojo's death provides crucial evidence for theories about his potential return. The symbolic geography of choices that appeared to govern where various deceased characters would proceed in their post-mortem existence. The directional orientations that different individuals displayed during this gathering suggest not random positioning, but meaningful choices between different possibilities for continued development, beyond physical embodiment, options that reflect their spiritual preparation and remaining attachments to worldly concerns. Nanami and Haibara's positioning, facing toward directions that seem to represent acceptance of death and movement toward whatever lies beyond individual existence, contrasted sharply with the orientation that both Gojo and Geto maintained, their shared direction suggesting continued involvement with worldly affairs despite their apparent deaths. The symbolic language of this scene indicates that death itself might represent choice point rather than absolute boundary. opportunity for consciousness to select among different possibilities for continued development. The fact that Geto appeared in this scene, despite his body being possessed by Kenjaku, suggests that consciousness can persist independently of physical form when spiritual development has achieved sufficient integration to maintain coherent identity across radical transitions in circumstance and embodiment. His presence alongside Gojo indicates that their fundamental bond survived not just their ideological conflicts, but the apparent finality of physical death, connection that transcends the limitations that seemed to separate them during their final years of opposition. The choice of direction that Gojo appeared to make during this airport scene reflects not resignation to death, but selection of path that allows continued service to those he had dedicated his existence to protecting and guiding. The possibility that he might choose return rather than advancement to whatever lies beyond suggests dedication that prioritizes collective welfare over personal liberation, the kind of bodhisattva commitment that postpones ultimate spiritual achievement in favor of continued assistance to those who remain trapped in cycles of suffering and conflict. But the most compelling evidence for Gojo's potential return lies in the incomplete nature of his spiritual development. Despite his overwhelming technical achievements, the way that his journey toward true enlightenment had been interrupted by circumstances that prevented him from completing the integration process that transforms individual consciousness into expression of universal wisdom and consciousness, compassion. His death occurred before he could fully resolve the tension between his extraordinary abilities and his fundamental isolation from genuine human connection. The Buddhist path toward enlightenment involves not just recognition of ultimate truth, but development of skillful means that allow such recognition to serve the welfare of all beings rather than creating further separation between the enlightened individual and those who continue to struggle with ignorance and suffering. Gojo's evolution toward greater wisdom and compassion was evident in his teaching career, but his final battle suggested that integration remained incomplete, that death came before spiritual maturation could achieve the balance between wisdom and compassion that defines complete enlightenment. The theoretical framework for return through spiritual awakening would involve not resurrection of his previous form, but transformation into someone whose capabilities serve enlightened purpose rather than personal achievement or institutional obligation. The Gojo who might return would represent evolution beyond the limitations that had constrained his previous existence, consciousness that had achieved integration between individual will and cosmic principle that makes genuine service possible without the psychological costs that had marked his earlier career. The timing of such return would need to align with circumstances that required intervention by consciousness that had transcended normal categories of individual and collective concern, situations where conventional approaches to conflict resolution had proven inadequate, and where enlightened perspective might offer possibilities that remained invisible to practitioners whose development had not achieved similar depth of understanding about the fundamental nature of existence and suffering. The capabilities that such transformed consciousness might possess would transcend his previous technical mastery while operating according to principles that honor the autonomy and dignity of all beings, rather than imposing solutions through overwhelming force. The enlightened Gojo would represent possibility for power that serves liberation rather than creating new forms of dependence or control. Strength that empowers others rather than requiring their submission or gratitude for protection they could not provide for themselves. But perhaps most significantly, the return of Gojo through spiritual awakening would demonstrate that death itself can serve as catalyst for development rather than simply termination of possibility, that consciousness, properly prepared, can use even apparent defeat as opportunity for growth that serves collective welfare in ways that previous existence could not achieve, despite overwhelming individual capability. His story would become testament to possibilities that exist beyond ordinary understanding of success and failure, victory and defeat, life and death. As we contemplate these theoretical possibilities for return through spiritual transformation, we find ourselves drawn into deeper questions about the nature of consciousness itself and its capacity for development that transcends every apparent limitation, the ways that dedication to collective welfare can create opportunities for continued service, even when individual existence seems to have reached its natural conclusion, and the possibility that love properly understood can survive and transcend every circumstance that appears to threaten its continuation and expression through forms that honor both individual dignity and universal compassion. The shadows cast by incomplete manifestations hold secrets that extend far beyond their apparent function as defensive techniques, revealing connections to mythological frameworks that transform what appears to be personal inability into prophetic glimpse of powers that could reshape the fundamental balance between human civilization and the supernatural forces that have threatened its existence since consciousness first learned to fear what lurked in darkness beyond the reach of firelight. Megumi Fushiguro's domain expansion, suspended between potential and actualization, may represent not failure of technique mastery, but unconscious recognition of capabilities so vast that complete manifestation would require spiritual development that his current existence has not yet achieved. The skeletal architecture that appears when Megumi attempts to create his complete domain bears striking resemblance to the fundamental bone structure of creatures whose size and power exceed normal biological possibility, suggesting that his incomplete technique is actually glimpsing the foundational framework of something so massive that his conscious mind cannot yet comprehend its full implications. The vertebrae-like formations that manifest represent not random imagery, but specific anatomical reference that points toward the eventual emergence of legendary creatures whose existence bridges the gap between physical reality and mythological archetype. The Gashadokuro of Japanese folklore represents one of the most terrifying manifestations of collective human suffering, transformed into supernatural threat. Enormous skeletal creatures assembled from the bones of those who died in battle, famine, or neglect, animated by accumulated resentment and hunger that transcends individual mortality to become expression of systemic injustice and abandonment. These beings possess size and malevolence that make them capable of affecting entire regions rather than just individual victims, representing the kind of threat that requires coordinated response from multiple powerful sorcerers working in perfect synchronization. The connection between Megumi's family heritage and these legendary creatures emerges through careful analysis of the Zenin clan's historical relationship with vengeful spirits and the specific techniques that their bloodline has, developed for summoning and controlling supernatural entities whose power derives from accumulated suffering and injustice. The Ten Shadows technique itself may represent not just individual capability, but inherited connection to spiritual forces that have shaped Japanese history through their intervention during periods when human conflicts reached levels that demanded supernatural resolution. The Zenin family's descent from Taira no Masakado, one of the three great vengeful spirits of Japanese tradition, establishes bloodline connection to figures whose deaths created spiritual disruptions so severe that they continue to influence contemporary events through mechanisms that transcend normal understanding of how individual mortality relates to ongoing historical processes. Masakado's rebellion and subsequent execution created spiritual resonance that has required ongoing management through ritual and technique across more than a millennium of careful spiritual maintenance. But perhaps most significantly, Masakado's daughter possessed abilities that align precisely with the capabilities that Megumi has demonstrated throughout his development as a sorcerer, suggesting that his technique represents not innovation, but inheritance of powers that have been preserved within family bloodline across centuries of careful cultivation and development. Her capacity to summon shadowy creatures, including Gasha Dokuro, indicates that the 10 Shadows technique may be capable of manifestations that far exceed anything that Megumi has yet achieved or even imagined possible. The army of frogs and snakes that historical records attribute to Masakado's daughter corresponds exactly with the Shikigami that Megumi has successfully summoned, but the legends also speak of her ability to call forth creatures of such size and malevolence that their appearance on battlefields could determine the outcome of conflicts that involved thousands of warriors whose individual capabilities were irrelevant compared to the supernatural forces that she could deploy through her inherited techniques and spiritual preparation. The book that appeared in Megumi's hands during his conversation with Jogo contains visual evidence that supports these theoretical connections. Illustrations that include Gashadokuro imagery, alongside other mythological creatures whose relationship to the 10 Shadows technique remains unexplored in the manga's current narrative development. The specific inclusion of these images represents not casual artistic choice, but deliberate foreshadowing that suggests Akutami's long-term planning for revelations that will connect individual character development to broader, mythological frameworks that encompass Japanese spiritual tradition. The fact that these visual references appear only in animated adaptation rather than original manga indicates collaboration between Akutami and animation staff that ensures consistency between different media presentations while preserving authors' control over how theoretical possibilities are suggested without being explicitly confirmed. The supervision that Akutami provided for these scenes demonstrates commitment to accuracy that extends beyond simple character design into careful management of how future plot developments are anticipated and prepared for through subtle visualques. The implications of Megumi's potential connection to Gashadokuro summoning extend far beyond individual character development into questions about the role that inherited spiritual responsibility plays in determining how extraordinary capabilities manifest and develop across generations of practitioners whose bloodlines carry obligations that transcend individual choice or preference. His technique may represent not just personal ability, but ancestral duty that connects him to historical patterns of supernatural intervention during periods of extreme social disruption. The size and power that Gashadokuro possess would make their successful summoning relevant not just to immediate tactical situations, but to strategic considerations that encompass entire regions or populations, creating capabilities that could influence the outcome of conflicts on scales that approach those of the ancient battles that originally gave birth to these creatures through accumulated suffering and injustice. The responsibility that would accompany such power would require moral development that exceeds anything that normal sorcerer training typically addresses. But the incomplete nature of Megumi's domain suggests that his consciousness is not yet prepared to accept the full implications of what his heritage makes possible, that his spiritual development must achieve greater depth and integration before he can safely access capabilities that connect him to forces whose malevolence and hunger reflect centuries of accumulated human suffering transformed into fresh, supernatural threat. The delay in his technique's complete manifestation may represent protective mechanism rather than simple technical limitation. The theoretical framework that emerges from analyzing these mythological connections reveals how contemporary supernatural conflicts may represent continuation of patterns that have shaped Japanese history since ancient times. Cycles of violence and resolution that require intervention by individuals whose inherited capabilities connect them to spiritual forces that transcend normal categories of individual power and collective responsibility. Megumi's role in these patterns may extend far beyond his current understanding or conscious intention. The foreshadowing techniques that Akutami employs throughout the series demonstrate sophistication that extends beyond simple narrative planning into systematic exploration of how mythological frameworks can inform contemporary storytelling while preserving the essential characteristics that make ancient legends relevant to modern audiences. The visual cues, character, relationships, and technique development that appear throughout the manga reflect understanding of how traditional spiritual concepts can be integrated with contemporary narrative structures without losing their fundamental significance. The Gashadokuro theory represents just one example of how careful analysis of background details, character heritage, and mythological references can reveal possibilities that remain hidden beneath the surface of explicit plot development, suggesting that the true scope of Akutami's vision encompasses not just individual character arcs, but comprehensive exploration of how Japanese spiritual tradition might manifest through contemporary supernatural fiction that honors both ancient wisdom and modern psychological understanding. As we contemplate these hidden patterns and their implications for understanding the deeper structures that govern supernatural conflict in the Jujutsu Kaisen universe, we find ourselves drawn into recognition that the most profound revelations often emerge not through dramatic announcement, but through gradual accumulation of evidence that suggests connections between individual destiny and historical patterns that extend across centuries of human experience, creating narrative possibilities that honor both personal agency and inherited responsibility in ways that reflect the complex relationship between individual choice and collective heritage that shapes all meaningful spiritual development and its expression through service to something greater than immediate personal concerns or temporary tactical advantages. The realm where logic surrenders to imagination reveals territories so bizarre and wonderful that they challenge every assumption about what constitutes reasonable speculation versus pure fantasy, creating spaces where the most outlandish theories achieve their own peculiar form of validity through the sheer audacity of their creative departure from conventional analytical frameworks. These theoretical constructions, born from the fertile intersection of devoted fandom and unbridled creativity, represent perhaps the most delightful aspect of how communities engage with fictional universes that provide sufficient depth and ambiguity to support infinite varieties of interpretive possibility. The nuclear bomb theory that connects Sukuna's malevolent shrine to the devastating weapons that ended the Second World War demonstrates how contemporary anxieties about human destructive capability can find expression through supernatural frameworks that transform modern fears into mythological narratives. The mathematical precision with which fans have calculated the similarities between nuclear blast effects and Sukuna's domain expansion reveals dedication to analytical rigor that transforms casual observation into comprehensive, theoretical framework that bridges physics and mythology in ways that honor both scientific accuracy and narrative possibility. The instant vaporization radius of early nuclear weapons, measuring approximately 200 meters from ground zero, corresponds with suspicious precision to the effective range of Sukuna's domain expansion, suggesting that Akutami may have drawn inspiration from the most devastating expressions of human technological capability when designing techniques for the King of Curses. The parallel creates thematic resonance that connects ancient malevolence with contemporary destructive potential, suggesting that supernatural evil and human innovation might produce comparable effects through completely different mechanisms. The shockwave patterns that characterize nuclear explosions share disturbing similarities with the cutting effects of dismantle, both creating damage that propagates outward from central points with mechanical precision that eliminates everything within specified ranges, regardless of individual resistance or protective measures. The comparison suggests that Sukuna's techniques operate according to principles that mirror the most devastating forces that human civilization has ever unleashed, creating symmetry between mythological evil and scientific achievement that reflects uncomfortable truths about the relationship between knowledge and destruction. But perhaps most unsettling is the correspondence between radiation effects and the way that cleave targets living beings specifically. Both forms of damage operating at molecular levels that make conventional defense impossible, while creating destruction that continues beyond the initial impact through processes that victims cannot perceive or resist. The parallel suggests that supernatural malevolence and atomic science achieve similar results through methods that transcend normal categories of cause and effect, creating devastation that challenges every assumption about the possibility of protection or recovery. The chef theory that attributes Sukuna's slashing techniques to culinary expertise represents delightful departure from serious analytical framework into realm of pure creative speculation that finds support in the precision and artistry that characterize his combat style. The suggestion that the King of Curses might have developed his legendary cutting abilities through professional food preparation transforms terrifying supernatural techniques into expressions of craft knowledge that honors the relationship between skill development and artistic achievement across completely different contexts. The correspondence between knife work and combat technique extends beyond surface similarity into recognition that both activities require understanding of anatomy, appreciation for precision, and commitment to excellence that transcends mere functional effectiveness to achieve aesthetic beauty through perfect execution of complex procedures. The theory suggests that Sukuna's approach to destruction reflects not casual violence but refined artistry that treats elimination of opponents as expression of creative vision rather than simple tactical necessity. Uraume's role as potential cooking assistant adds layers of domestic intimacy to their relationship that contrasts beautifully with the cosmic scope of their actual activities, suggesting that even the most legendary supernatural beings might maintain connections to ordinary human activities and the simple pleasures that come from shared work and mutual appreciation for craft excellence. The image of the King of Curses and his devoted follower collaborating on elaborate meals creates cognitive dissonance that highlights how even the most terrifying figures might retain aspects of personality that connect them to universal human experiences. The ice preservation techniques that would have been necessary during the Heian era, when refrigeration technology did not exist, provide practical justification for Uraume's cursed technique, while suggesting that their partnership might have originated through mundane necessity rather than supernatural destiny. The theory that their relationship developed through shared commitment to culinary excellence rather than conquest and domination offers refreshingly wholesome alternative to typical master-servant dynamics in supernatural fiction. The useless Miwa theory represents perhaps the most optimistic form of fan speculation, the determined belief that characters who appear to serve purely comedic functions must possess hidden significance that will eventually transform their apparent inadequacy into crucial plot relevance through revelations that recontextualize every previous appearance as careful preparation for moments of unexpected heroism. The theory reflects fundamental faith in narrative justice and the possibility that even the most overlooked individuals possess potential for meaningful contribution when circumstances align with their particular capabilities. The running gag of Miwa's self-deprecating commentary on her own limitations creates expectation that such consistent emphasis on incompetence must serve some larger narrative purpose, that the repeated jokes about her inadequacy are building toward reversal that will reveal hidden depths beneath surface appearances. The pattern suggests that Akutami may be employing misdirection that uses humor to conceal genuine preparation for character development that will surprise readers who have accepted her apparent uselessness at face value. But the deeper appeal of the useless Miwa theory lies in its reflection of universal human hope that everyone possesses unique value that might not be immediately apparent, but which could prove crucial under the right circumstances, that apparent mediocrity might conceal extraordinary potential that awaits proper recognition and opportunity for expression. The theory represents democratic faith in human worth that transcends conventional measures of achievement or capability. The Rika identity theory that suggests the cursed spirit accompanying contemporary Yuta represents different individual than the childhood friend who died in the movie, demonstrates how fan communities can develop complex explanations for what might be simple design, evolution, or artistic inconsistency. The theory requires elaborate framework involving accidental cursing of different person during Yuta's African training, creating narrative structure that preserves internal logic while accommodating visual changes that might otherwise represent continuity problems. The psychological implications of such identity substitution would create profound moral complexities for Yuta's character development, forcing him to confront the possibility that his most meaningful relationship might be based on mistaken identity rather than genuine connection to his childhood friend. The theory suggests emotional depths that would challenge his understanding of love, loss, and the nature of authentic human connection in ways that exceed anything that straightforward continuation of his original relationship could provide. But the appeal of such theories lies not in their probability, but in their demonstration of how devoted audiences can transform apparent inconsistencies into opportunities for deeper narrative exploration, creating interpretive frameworks that honor both textual evidence and creative possibility, while maintaining internal logic that supports suspension of disbelief. The theories represent collaborative storytelling between author and audience that enriches fictional universes through collective imagination and analytical dedication. The beauty of bizarre speculation lies in its revelation of how fictional universes can inspire creativity that transcends the boundaries of what creators originally intended, generating possibilities that honor both canonical evidence and imaginative freedom, while creating interpretive communities that find meaning and joy through shared exploration of theoretical possibilities. These theories represent not delusion but celebration, collective recognition that the most meaningful fictional universes are those that provide sufficient depth and ambiguity to support infinite varieties of creative engagement. And so we reach the gentle shores where speculation meets serenity, where the infinite questions that dance through Jujutsu Kaisen's shadowed corridors find their proper resting place, not in definitive answers, but in the peaceful acknowledgement that mystery itself holds beauty beyond any resolution. The theories we have explored together, from the profound to the playfully absurd, remind us that the most meaningful fictional universes are those that leave space for wonder, room for our own consciousness to wander through possibilities that stretch beyond the boundaries of canonical certainty into realms where imagination and analysis merge into something approaching meditation. These mysteries that we have contemplated, whether grounded in Buddhist symbolism or born from the delightful excess of creative speculation, serve as gentle companions for minds seeking rest from the harsh certainties that daylight demands. In the soft darkness where theories bloom like night flowers, we find comfort not in knowing but in wondering, not in conclusions but in the eternal questions that make existence beautiful rather than merely logical. Let these unanswered questions accompany you into peaceful sleep, where consciousness can drift freely through infinite possibilities without the need for resolution, where Sukuna might indeed have been a chef, where Gojo's return remains beautifully possible, where every theory holds equal truth in the democracy of dreams. Rest now in the infinite mystery, where all speculation becomes prayer, all wonder becomes peace.